Whew, this will be difficult to approach. I don't know how to do this and pull this off without being too provocative and too combative. Because while on the one hand, I think we definitely agree when it comes to intentions. I think we want to see the same things become reality. Like, for example, people being more capable of mutual understanding, being more aware of beauty in the other side, and being more aware of important distinctions that are to be made, and just generally being more appreciative of each other and being more pacified, if you want, and more embracing. Um, I think we definitely agree on those intentions, and I think even we are very similar as characters if you look at us. I mean, we are dudes. I'm in my 40s. I think you guys are in your 30s, and yet we look like we're in our 20s. And we speak very similarly. We speak with a toned down, calm voice. So we're very similar in many, many regards. And yet, when it comes to strategy and when it comes to the question of how can we succeed with that worldview, which I guess roughly to 80%, despite all the disagreements that we might have about specific interpretations and specific questions, I think we easily overlap to 80% in our worldview and attitudes and stance towards life. How do we get that to win in social warfare? Because this is the reality we find ourselves in. And the question is very simple, like, can you make our way of approaching reality win on a social level, win against its opponents? And what strategy would you use? And I think we couldn't disagree more about the strategy part. So my observation, just to start it off, has been that our worldview has been losing out in the past half a decade, very obviously so. We've not been winning, we've been losing, and we've been losing against clowns. And I would just stop for a moment and stop doing what we've been doing so far. Instead of continuing to do um, and just trying to just repeat the same thing and hope for a different outcome, I would just stop for a moment and ask myself the question: what is it that we progressives could be doing wrong, fundamentally and structurally wrong, so that we are losing out to clowns? Is it possibly us? Is it possibly something we're doing that makes us unprepared, that makes us incapable of winning in social warfare? So this is what I want to do now. Now, instead of jumping into the debate of the many different interpretations of Islam and Christianity, stop for a moment and reflect on what are the weaknesses of progressivism that might be built into it so that it's losing out in social warfare. And if I do that, if I do that, what I see in you guys and what I see in myself is this weird false humility, or this humbleness, in the sense that instead of going out there into the world and saying, chest out, this is who I am and this is what I stand for, and I would really want to see this flourish in the world. I want to express it. I wanted more people to adapt it. I would even want to fight for it, and I would want to die for it. Instead of seeing that, a sense of pride, what I see is a constant referring and redirecting obligation and redirecting responsibility to somebody else. So instead of taking up the responsibility and saying, this is who I am, this is what I stand for, and this is what I would fight for, I see you guys pointing to a different tradition and saying, but no, look at that tradition. This tradition is so beautiful. It's so awesome. Look at those wisdom leaders, those wise people who have brought forth so flourishing cultures. Look at those. This is really weird, because you guys are not children anymore. Neither am I. We should be grown-ups. And we should be in positions of leadership. We have certain experiences and we should be able to take up some responsibility. And yet what I see happening again and again, and this is something that I see particularly in progressive circles, instead of standing up for what we are and who we are, and be willing to sacrifice something for that identity, and be willing to actually spread that identity, even be willing to fight for that identity in social conflict and defend it, what we're responding with is exactly what Zach Stein has been saying, right? When the younger generation turns to the older generation and asks for advice, asks for orientation, asks for leadership. What are we guys doing? We're like, we don't know what's going on. It's all mysterious. Just we have no clue. Like we can't figure it out. But look at those traditions. They have figured it out. They're so smart. They're so wise. And there is this weird sense of romanticism there where you project a form of insight into an entire tradition and are not taking up the responsibility of defending who you are with all your weaknesses and with all your limitations. And what would this mean? This would concretely mean to just get out there and admit that you guys are atheists and just defend that. Now, I'm not an essentialist, so I'm not a big fan of the idea that there's just one thing, which is atheism, and everybody's an atheist. But I think context dependent when we are asking whether somebody's an atheist or not, depending on the context of the question, you can either score right or wrong. So, for example, when the question is, do you guys believe in revelation from one single book? So that revelation is happening through one single scripture. I think you guys would say no. In this context, it makes you atheists, whether you like it or not. If in another context, when the question is, do you guys think that spiritual insight and religious insight could come from something else than through scripture? So through experience, life experience, or intuition. I'm pretty sure you guys would say yes. This makes you atheists. Including, do you guys think that atheist and agnostic traditions, for example, which you could count Buddhism to, are sources for spiritual intuition and insight? I guess you guys would say yes. When it comes to the question, can we learn from different spiritual traditions at the same time? You guys would also say yes, this makes you more atheist than it makes you theist. When it comes to the question, do you believe in a personal God? Do you believe that God cares about you, that God loves you? What is your image of God? Like Jordan Hall had this recent conversion to Christianity. And for him, his crucial change in attitude was that for the first time in life, he felt like there's somebody else, a transcendent being, that loves him. This was new. When you are asked the question, do you feel you have a personal relationship to God, and God loves you, and God helps you, and God would smite your enemies, so God would influence reality in such a way as to help you and not your enemies, I'm pretty sure you guys would say, no, this is a wrong conception of God from the start. If this is what you think God is, it's not what we mean, right? Or do you believe, like the very simple question that Jordan Peterson was asked again and again and again, like, do you believe in God? And do you believe that Jesus Christ arose from the dead, in the sense that if you put a Panasonic camera recording the tomb, did he walk out there and then fly into the sky? I'm pretty sure you guys would say no, I guess. So depending on asking such contextual questions and avoiding essentialist questions about what theism and atheism are, I think you guys would score much more atheist in your attitude than typically theist, which cuts the other way around as well, of course. So when you ask questions about, for example, the nature of matter and whether consciousness goes all the way down, or questions about eros and agency, whether agency goes all the way down, I think you would not score typically materialist. So just because in certain contexts you're closer to being an atheist, it doesn't mean that you guys are closer to being materialists. It doesn't. However, the point that I want to make is, instead of going out there and saying, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, these are the insights that we have, and this is what we want to lead into, and it is important, it is valuable, and something worth dying for. Instead of seeing that, what we see in the entire progressive culture happening is this constant referral to somebody else who's supposedly to carry the responsibility and who supposedly carries the wisdom. But we don't. We don't have the wisdom. Yeah, look, guys, I mean, I don't think this is the way you win a war. I don't think this is the way you win a social conflict. And this is the situation we find ourselves in, whether we like it or not. And I wished it wasn't the case. And I wish that we could just continue delving into esoteric sources and finding beauty in all of them. But the reality of it is that we're finding ourselves in a very different type of conflict in which it is not giving you a natural advantage by being knowledgeable of all these differences existing out there. It doesn't make you win the social warfare that is actually happening. It actually weakens you. Because for the social warfare to be effective there and to make a positive influence and to push the whole thing into a positive direction, you have to do different things. You have to study your opponents and you have to know who your opponents are. You have to know what their weaknesses are. You have to have a very clear position that you're willing to defend. And if you don't play this kind, if you're not capable, if you're not willing to play this kind of game, the result will be just simply that you will lose. And I know this from first-hand experience. So my experience is I moved from a Western country, from Austria, so one of the I think, top 5 most progressive countries in the world. I moved to the Balkans. And what I had to figure out the hard way is that everything that makes you a good progressive makes you to be a bad Balkanese person. So everything that makes you successful within progressive culture makes you a failure within more conservative or more tribalized, actually, I wouldn't call it conservative, culture. All the things that make you virtuous in one context make you loser. And I'm sorry, just a loser and nothing else. You just don't have, in this regard, you might know things that are interesting, you might have even interesting views on things and have seen things that are beautiful and interesting, but it doesn't change the fact that you remain socially without any kind of impact. You just are not the kind of person who would make history. You're not the kind of person that would make a social difference. And when it comes to social struggle, what matters is not your individual views on specific theological, musical questions. None of that matters, but how able are you to navigate the lower left quadrants in integral terms? How able are you to actually swim in these waters and make a social impact and have an influence on other people? This is the only thing that actually matters. And I think it's important to be at least aware of how there are intrinsic features to progressivism which inherently make us incapable of winning wars. So this is the constructive direction that I would want to take. So Wilber has been making the point that if you find yourself in a social conflict of warfare where things are just too polarized, the only thing that would make you competitive is to reintegrate the ethnocentric and the tribal within you. So you kind of have to grow balls. If you don't, you will just be outcompeted. It is very typical that you cannot beat the ethnocentric with a modern mindset and with a modern attitude. And this is exactly what I experienced here on the Balkans. That you're basically incapable of competing on a social level with a relatively small group of people who are tribally organized. Those people punch way above their weight in the sense that they don't have to be the most intelligent people. They don't have to be the most charismatic people. But just by virtue of being tribal in their thinking, they easily beat out a large number of people who are modern and rather individualistic in their mindset. And the point that Wilber has been making is there is an asymmetry of competitive asymmetry between different worldviews here, and a modern mindset is generally at a competitive disadvantage against an ethnocentric one or a tribal one. The only way to actually balance out this kind of asymmetry is through the help of institutions, which impose certain rules and make it easier for the modern mindset to actually be powerful. But in places like the Balkans, where these institutions are not in place, you just lose. You're just hopelessly at a disadvantage. And it really doesn't matter how many interesting things you might have to say and how many interesting insights you might have about the world. It doesn't matter who you are as an individual. You still lose out. And we see a very similar phenomenon happening with Russia, by the way. Russia is punching way above its weight, just by virtue of being collectively and socially an entity which is more tribal and more ethnocentric than its Western counterparts. Just by virtue of that, it's capable of, with the economy of an Italy, right? This is something that people ridicule all the time. Despite of that, it's capable of punching against the enemy 10 times bigger in economic terms. And exactly the same thing is happening when you guys are entering this arena. I'm not sure you're aware of who your actual enemies are and who you're actually fighting against. Because my impression is that your actual enemies, your actual opponents, are not Western culture in general, but they're people like, for example, Mohammed Hijab. So you guys would actually be facing the challenge of being stronger and beating out opponents like Mohammed Hijab or opponents like Charlie Kirk. And I'm sorry to say, but I don't see you having any kind of bite against such opponents. I don't see you being consequential against such opponents. And it starts with the fact that you just don't know your opponents. You just don't know who you are up against. So see, I'm not going to try to make this magical point, the point that Wilber was making, reintegrate your ethnocentric and tribal nature, grow balls, become warriors, and become capable of fighting these culture wars. I don't think this is very realistic. I don't think we'll be able to do that. But the only thing I think we could at least point out to coming generations are the failure points of our progressive attitudes, and why it's so inconsequential and why it's losing out to clowns. And one of the failure points is that instead of studying our opponents from within, instead of spending time with people like Mohammed Hijab, and there's lots of content out there, and unfortunately he is influential when it comes to representing Islam, and not you guys. He's the one whom 90% of people actually finds to be representative of that tradition, and not you and your particular reading of Islam. And the same thing with Charlie Kirk. Mystical Christianity, or the form of Christianity that Marianne Williamson, for example, is representing, speaks to less than 10% of people. Everybody else who's representing Christianity finds Charlie Kirk to be the one who represents it, who stands for it. These are your real opponents, and you have to figure out strategically, like, what are their weaknesses? How can we approach this in such a manner that we can actually beat them when it comes to social warfare? Or take Dugin, for example, even though Dugin is not really, he's more influential in the West than he is actually influential in Russia. I think Russia is culturally a separate thing from what Dugin actually has built. And to many Russians, Duginism is itself a bit incomprehensible and mystical. But still, you would have to study figures like that and spend less time on the mystical traditions that you guys are so interested in and find so much joy and beauty in. Again, I understand intuition. The intuition is that, oh my God, there's so much beauty out there. And you want to share that beauty with other people, and you think that it will become influential, that it will actually catch on, that it will have the effect of inspiring people, that it will have the effect of eros, of driving them out of who they are. It's like, but look, at the end of the day, it's like me insisting that the following it would be like me insisting that Bach will become mainstream because there's so much beauty in Bach. You could spend your entire life, and every single piece that you wrote, it's insane. It's like a universe. You can take it up into so many different ways of interpreting it, and all of them are interesting. All of them are beautiful. But still, you would say I'm not right in my mind when I would expect that this becomes mainstream, that everybody listens to this and everybody finds beauty in this. But unfortunately, this is exactly the thing that we're expecting when we're hoping that people will find mysticism interesting and people will find, for example, Marianne Williamson's interpretation of Christianity, mystical Christianity, appealing. It's just not in touch with the reality of things. I'm just really sorry. This is something that works in a culture which is a talking culture, which is a culture where people spend most of their time reading, most of their time studying and looking at different facets and different ways of interpreting, seeing things. This is something that works for such a culture, which is a minority culture, whether you like it or not. It's not something that works for most people. Most people they don't even have the time to do all of that, particularly to do it without the leadership of somebody else who shows them and makes these things visible to them. So your expectations for mystical Islam and mystical Christianity to become more well understood, more mainstream, is just as realistic as my expectation that Bach, not my version of Bach, of course, but somebody else's well prepared and differentiated version of Bach would become the next big thing in the charts. It's just, I'm sorry, it's not going to happen. The alternative is to look out there and see who are you up against. Again, you're up against people like William Lane Craig, people like Mohammed Hijab, and to study your opponents and to see how you can be effective against your opponents and actually be able of punching back. That's the thing that you could do. And everything else, I'm really sad to say, I think, unfortunately strengthens your opponents. I've had progressive friends who have been making the point that in criticizing NATO, in criticizing the West, in criticizing American imperialism and focusing on that, they're actually doing a good thing. They're actually helping the West because they are helping the West to reform itself and to reinvent itself in a more sane and a better version. The reality of it, if I look at this situation, is that actually they were helping their own opponents. They were like digging their own grave. Because look at it. What is effective against the West? Speech. You can be effective against the West by spreading speech, by spreading narratives that are subversive. For example, subversive against NATO, subversive against American interventionism, and so on and so on. And the irony here is that exactly the same things that are weakening your own side of things are not effective. They don't have any kind of influence. They have no bite. They have like no teeth when it comes to your actual opponents. How effective do you think such form of speech, when expressed on the other side, say in Russia, you express an opposition towards the state? What do you think this will get you? How effective would this be? Well, I don't know. At best, people will laugh at you. At worst, you will get locked up. Just with speech, you won't make a difference in Russia. And just with speech, you are effective in societies which are already modern and postmodern. This is their dominant mode of generating themselves. It's through discourse. And through discourse, you are effective against them, but you're not effective against society which are ethnocentric or tribal in their structural organization. In those societies, you need to do different things. You can't just speak. You can't be smart about things. You must act in specific ways. And you have to show certain forms of courage, even be willing to take physical danger, like Navalny did, for example, into account, and be willing to stand up to really be able to make a difference. And even then, you can't really make a difference. So you see the disbalance here, and the reality of things is that despite the best intentions of saying, well, look, I'll clean up my own space, right? I'll criticize NATO, I'll criticize the West and America, and Russians will do the same thing for their own system, and let's hope that this will be effective. So instead of achieving that, instead of creating a world balance, in other words, of criticism against authoritarianism and ethnocentrism, what you end up doing is weakening your own position through speech, because it's open to the critique of speech and from discourse. You're subverting it. You're creating more and more and more competitive narratives that undermine authority. While on the other side of things, the Russians, they can't even use that. They are even not able to make a difference by just using speech. So what these Russians on the other side of things, those who are actually part of more ethnocentric societies would need, is you to get up and help them, right? Not focus on your own space, on your own small island, but actually help them in their fight against authoritarianism. But this goes against our intuition that, um, everybody is responsible for their own island, right? Right? Everybody is their own individual, isolated thing, and we don't want to do globalization. And that's the reality of it. What we, at the end of the day, do is, with this attitude, with this typically progressive attitude, we're strengthening authoritarian and ethnocentric systems everywhere. By overly emphasizing the ethnocentrism that is built into our own culture, and being unwilling and incapable to face it on a global scale and fight against it on a global scale, we're strengthening it. Because again, fighting against it in your own culture looks very different from fighting against it, for example, in the Balkans. If you wanted to be effective against authoritarianism and ethnocentrism on the Balkans, you would actually have to stand up and not just speak. You would have to organize people. You would have to learn rhetorics. So you'd have to learn how to fight people with rhetoric tools, something that is so disgusting in progressive circles. We would never want to be sophists, right? That's not what we want to do. We want to convince with truth and with actual insight, not with mere speech. But you would have to become Trumps, like little small Trumps. You would have to become like Trump to actually beat the competition. And I know this is something that from within just feels disgusting. You would never want to become like Trump. But that's the reality of it. If you have to become, in part, like Trump to win this whole thing. And the Balkans are basically, and this is something that you hear people say, people are recognizing in Trump a Balkan guy. I mean, just even his sense of aesthetics, the women he surrounds himself with, his sense of beauty, like what he pays attention to, the self-image that he has of who he thinks he is, the narcissism. He's like the typical Balkan guy who is now running the States and Balkanizing the entire country. So what you're experiencing is a form of Balkanization. So it's a bit like Bassem Youssef once said, you're now running into a world that just looks so familiar to us people who have been living on the Balkans or even in the Middle East. You're becoming exactly the kind of shithole that we've been acquainted all our lives with. We've known it from within, and you're like, ooh, where you're going now, we're coming back from. So we know this kind of culture. And in this kind of culture, you don't win by being refined, by being sophisticated and differentiated, and by just speaking all the time. You have to develop entirely different strategies to be effective and actually making a constructive difference. Again, not a kind of a difference where you're actually weakening your potential allies. And your potential allies, for example, are atheists, like the guy who does, I forgot his name. Rationality Rules is the channel, I forgot his name. He's, for example, has been consequentially going against your actual opponents, like Charlie Kirk, for example, or Mohammed Hijab, for example. But you will see that he's approaching this from an entirely different vantage point. He is approaching it from a vantage point of rhetorics. He's using rhetoric tools to make a point, and he's your natural ally. And instead of siding with him, you are subverting your own position and strengthening the opponent's side, which is that when you're not fleshing out who you really are, and again, I think you are more close to being atheists, to being progressives, to being deists than you are to being traditional conservative thinkers and traditional Christians or conservative Christians. Instead of expressing who you are and defending who you are, you're inviting people, you're making people interested into the perspective of, for example, Islam. You're inviting them saying, oh, look, there's so much beauty in there. There's so much interesting stuff in there. But then instead of defending your own position on Islam against that of Muhammad Hijab, you have invited people into the room and then left the room for Muhammad Hijab to dominate it, to take it over, right? Instead of defending Bach and insisting that it deserves more attention than some of the stuff that is out there in the musical world, what you're basically doing is you're saying, oh, music is so beautiful, look at the beauty of Bach, and then leaving the entire space to be dominated by somebody else who's just more capable than you are at leading the social warfare. And this is, I think, the general situation we find ourselves in. We are helping our opponents without really intending it. Just as, again, progressive friends of mine who thought they're doing the right thing by criticizing NATO and subverting NATO, but at the end of the day, they were doing nothing else but helping Russia dominate even more. They were not helping Ukraine with that kind of attitude.